Hello everyone. Welcome to the audio lecture on what we call the academic system. Now this was a system that imposed rules and guidelines for artists, and it led ultimately to the rebellion that became the Impressionism, or what we would call the Impressionist system. Now the period that we're going to be looking at is a time period of about 100 years, beginning in the mid-1700s. During this time, art in Europe was ruled by the academic system, and it set very specific standards for what was acceptable in a painting. At the same time, this was a time of great excesses in the French court, and the French court was ruled by powerful kings who really held absolute control over the masses. Now, eventually, this led to a massive revolt, which is called the French Revolution of 1789. And the French Academy was formed really to control artists during this volatile period, because artists have such a power to create political change. It was thought by Louis XIV that he really needed to keep artists in line. And so he gave his finance minister the charge to create guidelines for art that reflected the interests of the regime. Now, eventually, the English, they started their own academy, and it was pretty similar to the French, and it had the same real underlying motives, which was to keep artists sort of under control, within bounds. Now, in order for artists to ultimately be successful with the academies, their work had to be accepted into what was called the Salon. And this was basically a big art show that happened once a year and was sponsored by the French Academy or the English Academy. Now here's the deal. The Salon only accepted really rich white men. It really accepted men who had been trained at these expensive academic schools. They made a few exceptions for women, but basically you had to be affluent, and probably it was best if you were male in order to be even considered a successful painter during this time. The painting to the right here is done by one of the great stars of the academic system. His name was William Bouguereau. He's one of really the best known from this time period, and he served on the jury for the Paris Salon. In his work, you'll observe there are no visible brushstrokes, and each of his pieces is finished with a real painstaking polish. What we have here is realism taken to a very extreme degree. So the question that arises when you see a painting like this is, once you can reproduce a photographic looking image so well in a painting, where in the world does the artist go from there? And that will lead us ultimately to Impressionism. But first, let's look at a little history. Okay, now check out these two paintings. They are really exemplary of the excess of the French court prior to the French Revolution. Now, these very upper class noble men and women had to live at a very high level of luxury. Where'd they get the money for this? Well, they taxed the middle classes. So we have heavily taxed middle classes and extreme poverty in the lower classes and a very small upper class that made up the French elite. Now, one of the styles that was favored by this upper class is called Rococo. It originated in the Baroque style, but it's much more stylized and flamboyant. You know, one nice analogy I like to make to understand Rococo is to think about a little kind of a junky gift shop, maybe in Florida. And you see all this kitschy stuff. It's almost like so much that the eye can hardly take it in. Well, that's really similar to what we see in some of the Rococo work. This piece on the left is by Fragonard, and it was commissioned by the last mistress of Louis XV. And Louis XV was beheaded in the Revolution, so that was that. This painting that we see above left is of two lovers meeting in a secret tryst, and it was rejected by the woman who commissioned it. And that's probably why we still have it to this day, because the anger that was engendered by those that were revolting led them to destroy much artwork of the period, especially art that represented the upper classes. Now this painting on the right shows a royal wedding, and the reason that I want to show you this one is because you can see here how there's a painting on the wall, but then if you look closely, that wall becomes an actual physical material wall. So they've taken plaster and made fabric, sort of sculpted it to be a part of the painting. This over-the-top stylization is really what Rococo was all about. But now let's move on and look at a little different style of art, and that would be the art from the revolutionaries. One of the major groups that were active during the French Revolution was called the Jacobins. And really, they claimed to hold democratic views. But you know, they were also responsible for what is known as the Reign of Terror, in which thousands of people were killed, mostly with the guillotine. This group was under the leadership of Robespierre, and they dominated the French Assembly and basically just executed all of their opponents, whether they were from the aristocracy or even if they were fellow revolutionaries. So in 1793, they commissioned this group, the Jacobins, commissioned this artist Jacques-Louis David to paint a tribute to one of their leaders. Now, the reason I'm telling you all this is because it's a pretty interesting story. This leader's name was Jean-Paul Marat, and he had been a radical pamphleteer. In other words, he wrote these pamphlets that got everybody all riled up. And he had been largely responsible for these riots in 1792, in which hundreds of people were killed. Now this guy, Jean-Paul, he suffered from a skin ailment, so he really had to do most of his business sitting in a medicinal bath. And it was here that a young woman named Charlotte Corday attacked him with a knife and fled. So what we have here is a picture of him dying in the bath with one of his pamphlets in his hand. And we also have here a great example of what is known as the neoclassical style. So instead of exaggerating the scene, as we saw in the Rococo pieces, here we have a sort of a downplaying, an understatement that is actually quite powerful. And one thing I do want you to notice about this particular painting is that it's widely parodied. You can look on the internet and see that this same image is reproduced, only instead of the guy being in the bath, he's a man who's driving a lowrider and who has been shot. So this is one of those classic images that you'll see if you take a look at the history of art, that you'll see repeated again and again. So we have an interesting thing that happened by the 18th century, really towards the end of the 18th century, because then we have the advent of industrial manufacturing. So the visionaries of the day believed that these new goods produced in factories would be the answer to all the world's problems, because it would expand the middle class as workers were paid, but also that everybody would have a better material existence. Now this development, along with the revolutions that were happening in France and in the United States, led to something that's called the Enlightenment period. Now this is something to remember, actually, for your test. The Enlightenment really continued the theories of the humanists of the Renaissance. But what distinguished what's the difference between the Enlightenment period and the humanists was that the Enlightenment folks had an optimistic view. They really believed that humanity and its institutions could be profoundly reformed or even perfected based in part on this new industrial economy. So you know, Thomas Jefferson was a really famous follower of the Enlightenment theory. And it's interesting to look at that because his belief in this kind of optimistic view really helped us to have our Declaration of Independence, which gave rise to our nation today. So it's good to think about the Enlightenment ideal and the fact that our country was actually founded upon that ideal. But let's get back to art, shall we? This is a couple of works by Joshua Reynolds, and he was the first one to head the English Academy. He believed that the painting should reflect the stories and the ideals of antiquity. So here we have three sisters that are adorning the god of marriage. Okay, so they're probably unwed girls, and they're wrapping these garlands around the great god of marriage. There's a little moral there. And on the right, we have an actress, which was kind of a shady, profession, an actress and her tragic muse, which if you look close, it looks kind of like a scary unicorn. It's just over her right shoulder. It's like a scary unicorn rhinoceros, and there seems to be a rat-like figure on the other side. And that's how Joshua Reynolds depicted the muse of the actress. Well, that's kind of something. Hey, what about women during this time? Well, the Age of Enlightenment did bring some reforms for women, but there was this prevailing belief that their natural place was in the home. So women were really encouraged to be painters as long as they painted nice little still lifes and didn't push the envelope too much. Now, Rachel Roish was one of the most famous still life painters of the time. What's fun to notice in her work is she's almost always got something like the bumblebee or the dead flower or something to really make her still lifes not quite just a boring old collection of flowers. Now, I just love this painting to the right because it has a great story behind it. It's Adelaide Labiguiard, and here she is with two pupils. And she submitted this piece to the salon. This piece actually was painted to end rumors that her work was actually done by men. So the rumor went, oh, no artist this good could be a woman. My goodness, what is she thinking? So what she did was she painted this portrait of herself in regal clothing with two of the next generation of artists looking over her shoulder. And I love that as being sort of a sassy response. Oh, and then she submitted it to the Academy, and I believe it was accepted to the French Academy in the 1785 Salon. So there you go. She had the last word there. Now I just want to briefly go through this next artist, Angelica Kauffman. She's an interesting one because again we have this morality here. On the left, this painting is let's see, it's called Cornelia Pointing to Her Children as Her Treasures. So the point here is that there's a woman saying, look at my jewels. But Cornelia is so virtuous, she says, oh no, my jewels are my children. But that would be a good woman of the era of the Enlightenment period. All right, now Thomas Gainsborough, he's an interesting fellow. These are these romanticized images that were very common in the 1700s. Above are pictures of his two daughters, and unfortunately they both grew up to go insane. One was eventually committed to an asylum. Now look at this image on the left. This one it has some symbolism that I want you to remember. So it's kind of interesting, the pitcher. Okay, like a pitcher, a ceramic pitcher that you would hold water in. Well, if the pitcher is intact, that means a girl's virtue is intact. But if it's broken, not so good. So here we have a young girl with a partially broken pitcher looking very sad. I just find that odd, and I have no idea what that painting really means. Let's look at another one that I think is really funny. And this is along the same lines of the cracked pitchers or the not cracked pitchers. But here what we have is cracked eggs. But it's really another example of the same kind of a morality painting. This one is what we would call a genre painting. And that just means a painting that portrays scenes from daily life. Now in this one, as I said, we have broken eggs to take the place of the cracked jug. But the meaning is the same. And now if you look closely, this is just hilarious. Okay, first you have the girl whose eggs are broken in her basket. And then we have the suitor who's really trying to make excuses and get away. But if you look closely, the woman has got a hold of his wrist and he is going nowhere. And if you look very closely, little Cupid is over in the corner looking like, man, this is a bad day for Cupid. And he's putting his arrows, trying to kind of hide his arrows so no one would suspect. So anyway, there you have a genre painting with a little moral attached. Now let's look at a little bit more sort of mystical paintings of the time. There's something called Romanticism that came out of neoclassicism. Oh, and I'll tell you, you don't really have to remember all these schisms and isms. I'll tell you the ones that you do need to remember. What is important here is to notice the progression, to notice what's happening to art over this period of about 100 years. So this ends the first half of the lecture on the academic, neoclassical, romantic, all the isms, and I will start up with this slide in part 2.